Okay, well, thank you, Hannah. Thank you, everyone, for having me here. Very excited. I actually kind of presented a part one last year before I did all this work with the ideas, and so this is the after, I guess, having completed my master's. So, crowdsourced georeferencing Sanborn maps of Louisiana, and the project is at oldinsurancemaps.net. You can check it out right now. And so I'll give a little introduction and some context, and then I'll spend a bit more time about the georeferencing workflow that I kind of developed for this whole project. And then I ran a pilot project. I'll talk about that and some reflections on it, and then a little update on where things are. So just for some general context, I started with this kind of context that there's millions of stand maps that are available out there. Libraries and institutions have done a great job to put a ton of information out, and georeferencing them makes them way more useful if you want to do any type of spatial analysis or even visualization. So crowdsourcing has become a very common strategy for handling mass georeferencing projects. And as I started looking into more of the participatory archives and kind of library science literature about this, I got really interested in the idea of the archival commons, which I won't really go into. This is my reminder to say that there's a lot more to say about every slide, so find me after. I'd love to answer any questions you have. But this was kind of a concept of how to categorize different types of crowdsourcing efforts, and I really liked this idea. So it was like, how if we take that archival commons, some of those concepts in that framework, and bring that to crowdsourced georeferencing. So I decided to build a georeferencing web interface, or build a system. And for a number of reasons, I ended up choosing GeoNode, which is a open source spatial content management system, and take that system and then expand it for my needs, and then to connect it to the Library of Congress Sanborn map collection, and which, if you're not familiar, I spent a lot of time talking about it in previous. I thought maybe people might be somewhat familiar with these, but they're very large-scale, highly detailed maps of like every American city from around the turn of the century, 19th century or 20th century. And then to run a pilot project with it, so to see how it worked, basically. So what we're doing, and said another way, it's taking this is from the Library of Congress, from their digital collections, taking this content and then creating a whole system to get people involved in turning it into this. Every sheet here is georeference, et cetera. So a little overview of the technical kind of architecture I ended up settling with for the project. GeoNode, like I mentioned, is a content management system, and so you can store a few different types of resources in it. Documents are like non-spatial, maybe PDFs, or in this case, scanned historical maps. And then layers are actual geospatial data sets, like vector data sets or raster layers, which is what this project is all about. And then in GeoNode, you can author your own web maps from the content in there. So that was very appealing. Turned out to be not something anyone did, but I liked that concept, at least. And so then the first thing I did was build this extension kind of within the middle, add this extension that, which I'll show in a minute, has the tools for georeferencing the content and turning documents into layers, essentially. And on the Library of Congress Sanborn map collection side of things, I added this other app that was kind of scaffolding around curating all of the content for a given volume, showing progress across a volume, or loading that volume into the system. So people wouldn't necessarily know there are these two components. They would either interact with by loading the volumes in, or then kind of looking at progress, or they would use these tools for the georeferencing interface, but it all kind of looked like one from the outside. And GeoNode has GeoServer behind it, so again, a very attractive aspect of this was that once these layers are created, they are OGC compliant web services like WMS or WTMS, or WMTS, and so you can use them in software that we're all familiar with. So that was kind of the overall concept. So now I'll talk a little more about the workflow that I developed specifically for georeferencing. And I think you'll see, actually it's very generic, but it had to handle Sanborn maps, which have some complexities that that could be its own presentation. But on the other hand, I actually wanted to make something as generic as possible with the idea that, it could be reused elsewhere. So here are some underlying principles that I kind of had come to from past experience with georeferencing and thinking about this as a crowdsourcing project. So I wanted to have very modular steps, and I knew that there'd be at least a couple of steps, so I wanted to make that a very core component of the whole thing. And for crowdsourcing, this is great because different people can complete different parts at different times. And then I also wanted to think of it not like I'm creating geotiffs in the end, like that's the end goal, but it's more about creating the data that's necessary to warp or, process the data. So ultimately, the final rasters in this case should be disposable is kind of the mindset. And because they could be recreated programmatically. And then to embrace the idea, especially for crowdsourcing, of iterative work. So if you do it once poorly, someone else can do it better, basically. And then if something goes wrong, you have to be able to kind of revert to a past state or, retry processes. So those are kind of underlying things I knew that I wanted to work on. So I ended up with this 3-stage process. And so the first thing to do is to prepare the document, which basically is saying either it doesn't need to be cut, or maybe it needs to be cut into separate pieces because there's either an inset or maybe it's just 2 separate halves but on the same piece of paper. Very common in Sanborn maps. And then to georeference, and then trim, where you can add a mask around the outside if you want. So then here are the tools that I like, one tool per step, basically. So this preparation step, if it's a single map, you just say it doesn't need to be split, and then you go straight to georeferencing, which is nice because in that case, you don't need to define a masked polygon or do anything like that. But I wanted to create this to be as simple to use as possible, so it's kind of like just scissors. So you just cut across, and then you can add as many cuts as you need to get down to a single, a set of documents now that comprise the entire thing, but are treated individually. The georeferencing interface is really like any other that you've seen. If you're familiar with this concept at all, on the left, you're defining a spot on the historical map, and then on the right, you connect that to, in this case, I have OpenStreetMap for the base map, and you're just kind of creating these linkage points called ground control points. And so once you have 3, I added this like a live preview that pops up and shows where this warping is placing that document. And so GDAL is used in the back end, which is the same, so the same processes are able to be run in this preview as exactly is used once you submit these points to process the layer. And then trimming I thought of as a pretty, I mean, I knew it was important for Sanborn maps, but I didn't want to say like, you have to do this on every single one. And part of the reason is, turns out there's a much better way to do it, and I'll get to that at the end. So this is the third thing, the third interface. So looking back at those steps as data creation, then what we're gathering is these divisions from the first step, and then ground control points from the second step, and then these masked polygons from the third step. So again, I wanted to handle the complexity of Sanborn maps, but this is pretty generic in a lot of ways. You don't have to split anything. You don't have to trim it. You could just georeference a single sheet and you're done. So looking at the idea of iterative work, this led to the concept of storing 2 different types, or kind of 2 different types of data storage. So canonical data, which is the current ground control points applied to a given document, creating the layer, or, which I guess I'll highlight. So that's kind of the canonical, like the existing current ones. Or you want to, if someone does 2 different times, you want to be able to go back to the old one. So the input data is also stored in this idea of session data. And I'll talk about a little more about that here. So when someone enters one of those interfaces that I was showing, a new session is created, and then they do their clicking and they create some data, those either lines or control points or the mask. That is then saved to that session, and then really after they submit, then there's like a running process that kind of applies that to the resource that either the document or the layer. So one of the best things about this is that the sessions become data in themselves, and see some of that later. Other advantages is that this goes a little more to the idea of the archival commons. So you're kind of creating narratives of what's been going on within the system, who's been working on different documents and layers. And so this was kind of a summary page I added for each layer or each document to show what had been performed on that resource. So again, it's just kind of creating a little more of a user data-driven environment. And on the Sanborn map side of things, I'll just show this as a screenshot. Probably the most important thing throughout the project was this volume summary page that kind of pulls in all of the layers and documents and everything that's been happening for a given volume. And I found this volume concept. It's like an item in the Library of Congress collection. So in this case, New Orleans there were 4 volumes that I included, but other cities, very small cities, like Abbeville, Amite, they might have not even a volume, really just an edition that just has like 2 pages in it, or 1 page. So that was kind of item equals volume in my terminology, if it's not quite correct in some cases. So for the pilot project, I deployed the platform to this website, this domain, oldinsurancenos.net. I ran it kind of public, open to anybody in February through May of this past year, and I geographically, thematically made available all the content across Louisiana. And you'll see why in a second, I suppose. But I wanted to focus and did as many old cities or cities across the whole state, like focus on older maps. But I didn't want to just open it up to anything. I thought it would have a little more weight and be a little more interesting if it was more geographically focused. And one of those reasons is that I wanted to reach out to local social media groups or historical societies. Here's some examples of places I posted, stuff like that. Also, I did about as much as I could do, but I don't think that's very much compared to what an institution could do, right? So like it was kind of just me talking to a lot of people. And so with any amount of more backing from more, membership lists, all that stuff could really spur a lot more involvement. So let's get some charts going. Like I mentioned, sessions kind of became their own data point, which is pretty cool. And we can see across the course of the project, people participated in some sort of waves. Some of these correspond to outreach events. Like I didn't post on Reddit till the end of March because I had these like, I want to finish this, I want to finish that. Lots of different. You can't just release it and be done. There's like a lot of things you have to finish after you finish it. Still finishing. And you can also take these sessions per volume, which was a pretty interesting thing. So you can see, again, kind of a story of how people like interacting with this content. So someone loaded this volume in the very beginning, and it just sat there until like kind of early March. Someone prepared every document on the same day. And then later, people started doing some of the like georeferencing individual things. Also, wasn't really planning on this, but it turns out, storing creation dates and then run time of the sessions, you actually get like elapsed time for every single one, which is really cool, and shows a lot about how people use the site. And then, average time for georeferencing X, Y, and Z. So just a lot of information that the whole model kind of made possible. And then some stuff I wasn't expecting, like if it doesn't need to be split, all of a sudden we know how many Sanborn map sheets in this collection are like full sheets. Kind of interesting. And then there's one here that was split into 10 pieces. So you could go find that, right? That'd be kind of cool to see that one. So in terms of user engagement, about half of the people who signed up did at least one thing. As is the case with a lot of crowdsourcing projects, a very small amount of people did a lot of work. And then as maybe an extreme example, one user did like 80% of the work. And that was not me. I know who it is. But so someone got really into it, right? And so thinking about those categories, well, I also gave a survey out to kind of see why people were interested, and kind of lightweight survey, frankly, but why not? And so I came up with kind of 4 categories. And so single city users, I call them, people who loaded up a city, which was presumably their hometown, and didn't do anything else, which is in a way like, oh, you're not contributing. But on the other hand, it's like they're actually putting their flag down, like this is the city I'm interested in. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Capable passersby, I called people who were like did some work, and you could see they understood it and they got into it, but they didn't really like do a lot more. And enthusiasts who maybe like 20 to 150 sheets or that kind of thing, they like really would like do a whole town and like New Iberia and be like really into it. And then the power user group of one, the username was Wally Kitty. And I got a picture later of Wally Kitty. So that's the power user group. Very active with the mouse, I guess. Didn't plan that, actually. So some reflections quickly. Like I mentioned, this idea of single city users, I actually kind of really like that because they probably have the strongest connection to a specific city or to the maps. And it would have been really great to have a better feedback loop. So, you know, maybe someone loaded one in the beginning, they're like, I have no idea what's going on this site, and then left. It'd be nice if they got a notification or whatever, like come back, now someone else has done a bunch of work on this one. And although I wasn't planning on one person doing so much, on the other hand, it kind of shows it to work out really well. If you have a trained user, we could really knock out a lot of this work if you really wanted to. So that's actually kind of great in a lot of ways, proves some of the concepts, I think. And one thing that really fueled me through the whole process is that while certain cities, like Milwaukee, Indianapolis, I think, or Bloomington, Boston, they have like large institutions that have done this for all their Sanborn maps. They have nice viewers, like this is really great resources in larger cities, but part of setting this whole infrastructure up was that it could be done for any small town because these maps exist for any small town at a pretty incredible scale. So I really liked that, like, okay, this could be done anywhere. This is, not just for one big city. I show New Orleans a lot because that's like what everyone wants to see, but there's 137 other cities in Louisiana that were all georeferenced to some degree. It wasn't like complete, and there's a lot of other details or caveats about what is really georeferenceable or not. And then one other thing I learned is, I knew this, I didn't learn it, but I knew that Sanborn maps were really cool, and then there's actually a lot more to be gained by handling them at the volume scale. And so I'm going to show some of the things I've done in the last, since this finished up. And one of them really gets to this last one. So instead of trimming each individual sheet like I had shown, as a discrete one-off, you do this, and then trim the sheet, and then go on to the next one, I realized, and I kind of shout out to the Boston Public Library, has some really great, the Leventhal Map Center has some really great resources out there about urban atlases. And so using some of that ideas they have there, I put this kind of prototype really up, but the idea is that if you create a shape per layer and then snap them all together, and it's much quicker to trim the whole volume into an actual contiguous mosaic. And then, then those, again, that's data you can run processes on to kind of generate a single geotiff if you want, or something like that. So that was something that at the end of it was like, that should have done that. So I couldn't really resist doing it. The other thing is that people really want to be comparing different years, the same city from different years. So this is what I thought people might do with the web map component in GeoNode, but no one really did. And then I realized this is kind of all you want to do with these layers in a way. You're not going to compare different cities, obviously, so or at least within a map. So kind of automatically pulling everything together per place. And then I've been changing some of the tech underneath. GeoServer and GeoNode are pretty heavy duty, and the user authentication, all that system worked well because I knew I wanted some structure around that. But then there's a lot of vector management. There's a lot of stuff in there that I don't need at all. So I've kind of been swapping out all of the GeoServer utilities for a piece of software called T-Tiler from the company Development Seed, and it's been really fun to work with. So really liking that. my background is a lot more like programming and stuff, so this has been really fun, especially this side of the improvements. So finally, lots more ideas for improving things. Some of those charts are not really on the front end of the site at all, so pulling more of that would be, I think, really more interesting and engaging. Thinking of how could this exist longer term, it maybe like you sponsor the addition of maps for your city, something like that. A lot of work has been happening at allmaps.org. Bert Spahn working on georeferencing directly from IIIF, which is really cool. And this system that I set up could kind of swap out again, because we're thinking of the data more than the data sets. And of course, very interested in any funding, FYI, collaboration, et cetera. So, just kind of starting to look around that, but that's all. So thank you very much, especially thanks to all the people who did the work that you just saw. And you can find me these ways, or after the session, happy to answer any questions, especially about Sanborn maps or all this. So thank you very much.
Few minutes. Thank you for that. That was amazing. My team and I went to the Library of Congress maps last week, so those maps are really good, and your study is amazing. So do we have questions from the group? Yes, please.
I'm not sure if you covered this, but is there any quality control that's built into this?
Good question. No. It was kind of the main thing. For one, with these Sanborn maps, you can line them up relatively easily because they're so large scale. So that was kind of the first thing, was getting all this together to, be able to put it together. I think adding error, there's so much more to do when it comes to quality control. Even, I think, again, you can see I'm pretty workflow focused, but just kind of changing some of this around, like I realized this trim step, this where I'm like trimming all of the ones in a volume, that's its own quality control, because you're looking at each one finally, and then you're like, that looks terrible. So you don't want to make a little trim for it. So quick answer, not yet. But yeah, someone asked that last year too. Yeah. Who knew? Cool, thanks.
Ask again next year.
Yeah.
So, do we have more questions? Yes.
Well, quality control was my first question, because in Milwaukee we had an experience.
Oh, great.
The number of streets shifted at a point 30 something.
Yeah.
So people were sort of systematically missing.
Yeah. Well, I would say one thing, actually, I like the idea of just making it easier. So once, I didn't really show it, but these Sanborn maps typically have a key map. And so once someone has georeferenced the key map, and then I made a real simple like checkbox, this is the key map. Once that's been done, if you go and georeference in either of the sheets, then that key map is shown behind on the georeferencing interface. So then it's like, oh, I'm doing sheet 10. Let me zoom into what is sheet 10. May not be exact, but like, so there are some aspects of it that I wanted to just make it easier for people to not do it poorly. Not to say that it didn't happen, but that was kind of one of my, so sorry. Yeah. If you had another question. Okay, yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more.
So there's a lot of experiments in this kind of online image georeferencing. And I remember a lot of them kind of break down because you end up needing a lot of disk space for all the non-rectified and rectified images.
Yeah.
But it seems like we were focusing on that kind of metadata, the different polygons, points and polygons. You can almost just grab them live off of the LOC and rectify them live.
Yes, so no, it's not what I'm doing. That is exactly the model behind, I mentioned allmaps.org. If you go to allmaps.org, Dutch developer named Bert Spahn, and he's been essentially taking IIIF tiles and then applying georeferencing information to them directly in the browser with exactly what you're saying in mind, is that you don't store it. This system I set up is like, wow, he must have done GIS on a desktop for a lot of years, like it's actually file manipulation. And then, but again, if you're storing this, like I did set it up so it's all stored there, presumably I could swap it all out and then just, put in the all maps kind of front-end logic and pull it straight from the Library of Congress. So I don't feel like it's going backwards the way I've set things up, but it's probably not the most forward thinking because yeah, there's like storage space. That was another main reason I didn't say like go for any volume ever in this. Like I wanted to contain it to Louisiana and for a couple of reasons. And disk space was one of them. Yes. Yep.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks
you
everybody.
for your question.